Richard Saunders sat heavily on the worn-out couch in the dimly lit living room, the weight of the world pressing down on his shoulders. The house around him was a testament to years of struggle, with peeling wallpaper, creaky floorboards, and a persistent damp smell that never quite went away. His eyes drifted to the cracked window, through which the last rays of sunlight cast long, mournful shadows. From the adjacent room, the muffled sound of Emma's sobs reached his ears. She was crying again, as she had been for the past few weeks, ever since their son Tommy had fallen ill. They couldn't afford the medication he needed, and the thought gnawed at Richard's insides like a relentless parasite. Tommy, just 7 years old, lay in bed, too weak to play or even smile. Richard's heart ached with a mix of guilt and helplessness. Lucy, his 18-year-old daughter, was the only glimmer of hope in their bleak existence. She was beautiful, with a strength and resilience that belied her years, but it pained Richard to see her bearing the brunt of their financial woes. Lucy had taken up multiple jobs, working long hours to keep food on the table and a roof over their heads. Yet, despite her tireless efforts, they were barely scraping by. Richard's hands trembled as he rubbed his face, the stubble rough against his palms. He had been out of work for nearly 3 months now, a victim of the economic downturn that had left many like him jobless and desperate. Each day was a reminder of his failure to provide for his family, a burden that grew heavier with each passing hour. "Richard," Emma's voice, weak and filled with despair, called from the bedroom. "Tommy's fever is getting worse. We need to get him to a doctor." Richard's throat tightened as he stood up, forcing a reassuring smile he didn't feel. "I'll figure something out, Emma. Don't worry." He stepped into the bedroom where Emma sat beside Tommy's bed, dabbing his forehead with a damp cloth. Tommy's eyes were closed, his little chest rising and falling unevenly. Richard's heart twisted painfully at the sight of his son, so fragile and vulnerable. "How are you feeling, champ?" Richard asked softly, sitting on the edge of the bed. Tommy opened his eyes briefly, managing a weak smile. "I'm okay, Dad," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Richard swallowed hard, fighting back tears. He couldn't afford to break down, not now. He needed to be strong for his family. As he left the room, his phone rang, the shrill tone slicing through the heavy silence. He glanced at the screen, recognizing the number immediately. The loan shark. With a deep breath, he answered. "Hello? You've got 24 hours, Saunders," the voice on the other end growled. "If you don't pay up, we'll be paying you a visit, and it won't be pleasant." Richard's stomach churned with dread. "I just need a little more time, please." "Tick-tock, Saunders. You know the deal." The line went dead. Desperation clawed at Richard's chest. He needed a solution, and fast. His eyes fell on the old desk in the corner of the room. Crossing over, he rummaged through the cluttered drawers until his fingers closed around a small, weathered business card. The words, "Quick Solutions for Tough Problems," were printed in bold letters, along with a phone number. He stared at the card, his mind racing. This was a last resort, a gamble with unknown consequences. But what choice did he have? Richard dialed the number, his hands shaking. "Hello?" A smooth, confident voice answered. I need help," Richard stammered. "I was given this card. I'm in a lot of trouble." There was a pause before the voice responded. "Meet me at the corner bistro in an hour. Ask for the Jaguar." Richard's pulse quickened. "I'll be there." Hanging up, he looked around the dilapidated room one last time. He had to do this. Stepping out into the cold night, he made his way to the corner bistro. The neon sign flickered, casting an eerie glow on the quiet street. Richard's heart pounded as he approached the door, feeling a deep sense of dread. Inside, The restaurant was dimly lit, a stark contrast to the harsh reality outside. The air was thick with the scent of expensive cologne and fine food. Richard's eyes scanned the room, landing on a group of men in tailored suits. They were massive, their broad shoulders and towering frames dwarfing his own slight build. One of them noticed him and nodded, gesturing for him to come closer. Richard swallowed hard and walked over, his legs feeling like lead. The men parted, revealing a man seated at the head of the table. He was impeccably dressed, his suit immaculate, and his presence radiated authority and danger. This was the Jaguar. "Mr. Saunders, I presume?" The Jaguar's voice was smooth, almost silky, but carried an undertone of menace. Richard nodded, his throat dry. "Yes, that's me." "Sit," the Jaguar commanded, and Richard complied, sinking into the plush chair across from him. The Jaguar eyed Richard for a moment before speaking again. "I understand you're in quite a predicament. You need money and quickly, but the question is, what can you offer in return?" Richard's mind raced. "I can work for you. I'll do whatever it takes," he said, desperation clear in his voice. The Jaguar chuckled, a cold, humorless sound. "Work for me? Do you really think a man in your condition is of any use to me?" Richard flinched, but before he could respond, the Jaguar continued. "No, Mr. Saunders, I'm afraid you don't have anything of value, except perhaps one thing." Richard's stomach tightened as the Jaguar reached into his pocket and pulled out a photograph. He slid it across the table. It was a picture of Lucy. "She's 18, isn't she? Fresh, young, just the type I like?" Richard's heart sank. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "No, that's not an option." The Jaguar's expression remained unchanged. "Sit down, Mr. Saunders. If you don't agree, then our deal is off, and you know what that means for your family." Richard's mind was a whirlwind of fear and guilt. He thought of Tommy lying sick at home and Emma's tear-streaked face. The pressure was unbearable. In his mind, Tommy was the one who would take care of him and Emma in their old age. Lucy, on the other hand, would marry and become part of another family. The sexist notions he had grown up with started surfacing. He thought bitterly that Lucy, once married, would essentially become a stranger, contributing nothing to their family anymore. With a heavy heart, he sank back into the chair. "What exactly do you want?" The Jaguar's smile was predatory. "It's simple. You give me your daughter, and I give you the money you need. $100,000. Enough to settle your debts and take care of your family." Richard's hands shook as he considered the unthinkable. He felt trapped, with no way out. The image of Tommy's pale face flashed before his eyes. "Okay," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I'll do it." The Jaguar's smile widened. "Good. I knew you'd see reason." He extended his hand, and Richard, feeling like he was signing a deal with the devil, reached out and shook it. The grip was firm, final, sealing his fate. Richard left the restaurant with a check for $100,000 in his pocket, but his soul felt empty. The weight of his decision bore down on him with every step he took. He had betrayed his own daughter, sacrificed her for the sake of his family's survival. The thought made him nauseous. As he walked through the dark streets, Richard couldn't shake the image of Lucy's smiling face from his mind. He had just destroyed her trust, shattered her future. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. He arrived home to find Emma still awake, worry etched into her features. "Richard, what happened? Did you get the money?" Richard nodded, unable to meet her eyes. "Yes, I got it." Emma's relief was palpable, but Richard felt none of it. He handed her the check and she gasped. This is more than enough. How did you... Richard looked away, the guilt overwhelming. Don't ask, he muttered. Just make sure Tommy gets the medicine he needs. Emma stared at him, confusion and concern mingling in her gaze. But she didn't press further. She took the check and went to prepare for the next day. Richard collapsed onto the couch, burying his face in his hands. The gravity of his actions settled heavily on him. He had made a deal with a monster, and now his daughter would pay the price. Lucy walked home from her job, her feet aching and her mind heavy with thoughts of the mounting bills. She knew her family was struggling, but she was determined to do whatever she could to help. The streets were quiet, the only sounds being the distant hum of traffic and the occasional bark of a dog. As she turned the corner to her house, a black van screeched to a halt beside her. Before she could react, two men jumped out, grabbed her, and pulled her into the van. Lucy struggled, kicking and screaming, but it was no use. The men were too strong. They tied her hands and covered her mouth with tape. She tried to scream, but the sound was muffled. The van sped away, leaving her home behind in the darkness. Hours later, the van finally stopped. Lucy was dragged out and shoved into a large mansion. The place was opulent, with marble floors and crystal chandeliers. The men pushed her into a dimly lit room and left her there, locking the door behind them. She looked around, her eyes slowly adjusting to the darkness. A tall man with a cold, cruel smile entered the room. Well, what do we have here?" he said, his voice dripping with malice. Lucy stood up, her heart pounding. "Who are you? What do you want with me?" The man chuckled. "My name is Jaguar. Your father sold you to me, my dear. You're mine now. If you try to run, I'll break your legs. So, be a good girl and do as you're told." Lucy felt a surge of anger and fear. "My father would never sell me. You're lying." Jaguar's smile widened. "Oh, but he did. He made a deal with me to save your family. You're the price he paid." Lucy felt her knees weaken. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. Her father had betrayed her, sold her like a piece of property. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she forced herself to stay strong. She couldn't afford to show weakness, not now. Jaguar turned to leave. "You'll start working tomorrow. And remember, if you try to escape, there will be consequences." As the door closed behind him, two men re-entered the room and roughly escorted her down a series of dark, twisting hallways. They stopped in front of a heavy iron door, unlocked it, and pushed her inside before locking it again. Lucy looked around the small, dimly lit room. Her eyes soon fell on a small figure huddled in the corner. "Hey, are you okay?" she whispered, approaching cautiously. The figure looked up. It was a boy, no older than 10, with tear-streaked cheeks and bruises on his arms. His clothes were tattered and dirty, hanging loosely on his gaunt frame. Lucy knelt down beside him, her heart aching at the sight of his injuries. "What's your name?" she asked softly. "How old are you?" The boy sniffled and wiped his eyes. "I'm Matthew," he said, his voice trembling. "I'm 10. Lucy nodded, trying to offer a comforting smile. "Why did they take you? What did you do?" Matthew looked down, his voice shaking. "They took me because my parents couldn't pay their debts. They said if I didn't follow the rules, they'd hurt me. And they did." Lucy felt a pang of sympathy. "That's terrible," she said. "But why did they hurt you like this?" Matthew glanced at her, tears welling up in his eyes. "They do this to everyone who doesn't follow the rules. You have to be careful. Just do what they say, and maybe they won't hurt you too." Lucy felt a chill run down her spine. Thank you for the warning. We'll have to be smart and stay strong. We have to look out for each other." The next day, Lucy and Matthew were put to work. The tasks were grueling, and the overseers were cruel. But Lucy kept her promise to Matthew. She taught him to read and write, using scraps of paper and broken pencils she found around the mansion. Matthew quickly grew to trust Lucy, looking up to her as a protector and mentor. Despite the harsh conditions, he began to smile again, finding comfort in their lessons and in Lucy's unwavering support. One evening, as they sat together in their cramped quarters, Matthew asked, "Why are you helping me, Lucy?" Lucy smiled softly. "Because you're just a kid, and you deserve better than this. I won't let them break us, Matthew. We have to stay strong and look out for each other. We're all we have." Over time, Lucy developed a fierce sense of responsibility for Matthew. She saw in him the same vulnerability she felt, and it fueled her determination to protect him at all costs. They formed a bond, finding solace in each other's company amidst the chaos and cruelty of their new reality. As weeks turned into months, Lucy's resolve only grew stronger. She knew they had to find a way out, but she also knew that they needed to be patient and careful. Through it all, Lucy's anger at her father simmered beneath the surface. She couldn't understand how he could have betrayed her so completely. But she also knew that dwelling on that anger wouldn't help her or Matthew. She had to focus on surviving and protecting the boy who had come to depend on her. Lucy tightened her grip on the tray she was holding as she moved through the crowded room. The grand hall of Jaguar's mansion was alive with the sound of clinking glasses and murmured conversations. It was one of his infamous parties, filled with influential figures and underworld associates. The opulence around her seemed to mock her despair, but Lucy had learned to mask her emotions. As she made her way to the back of the room, she spotted Matthew huddled in a corner, looking pale and terrified. Her heart sank as she saw one of Jaguar's men towering over him, fist raised. Without thinking, Lucy rushed forward, dropping the tray with a clatter. "Stop it!" she shouted, drawing the attention of everyone in the room. Jaguar, seated at the head of a long table, looked up, his eyes narrowing. "What's going on here?" The man halted mid-swing, turning to face Jaguar. This little thief was trying to steal food. Jaguar's gaze shifted to Lucy, who stood protectively in front of Matthew. "And you, Lucy, why are you interfering?" "Please," Lucy said, her voice trembling but resolute. "He's just a child. He didn't mean any harm. I'll do anything. Just don't hurt him." Jaguar leaned back in his chair, studying her. The room had gone silent, all eyes on the unfolding drama. "Anything?" he asked, a sinister smile playing on his lips. Lucy swallowed hard, nodding. "Yes, anything." Jaguar stood up, the room parting for him as he approached her. He stopped a few feet away, looking down at Matthew, who clung to Lucy's leg. "Very well," he said. "I have a task for you, a test of your loyalty." Lucy met his gaze, her heart pounding. "What do you want me to do?" Jaguar's smile widened. "There's a rival gang leader, Don Carlos. I want you to infiltrate his nightclub and poison him. Prove your loyalty to me, and the boy lives." Lucy felt a cold chill run down her spine. It was a death sentence, but she had no choice. "I'll do it," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Good," Jaguar said, turning away. "You leave tonight." Lucy was led to a dressing room where she was given a shimmering, seductive dress that clung to her figure. A small vial of powdered poison was handed to her by one of Jaguar's men. "Just a pinch in his drink," he instructed. "Make sure he consumes it all." She nodded, her mind racing with fear and determination. She had to survive this. For Matthew. Later that night, Lucy found herself standing outside Don Carlos's nightclub. The music inside was loud, the lights flashing. She took a deep breath, straightened her dress, and walked in with as much confidence as she could muster. The bouncers at the door barely gave her a second glance as she made her way inside. The club was packed, the air thick with smoke and the scent of alcohol. She scanned the room, spotting Don Carlos surrounded by his entourage in a VIP section. Lucy approached cautiously, swaying her hips and putting on a flirtatious smile. One of Don Carlos's guards stepped in her path. "What's your business here?" She leaned in, lowering her voice to a seductive whisper. "I heard Don Carlos throws the best parties. Thought I'd see for myself." The guard looked her over, his expression skeptical. "He's not looking for company tonight." Just as Lucy's heart began to sink, Don Carlos looked up and noticed her. His eyes lit up with interest. "Who is that?" he called out, waving the guard aside. "Let her through." The guard hesitated for a moment before stepping aside, allowing Lucy to pass. She made her way to Don Carlos, who extended his hand to her. "I'm Don Carlos," he said, his voice smooth. "And you are?" "Lucy," she replied, offering her hand. He pulled her close, his eyes roving over her body. "Why don't you sit with me, Lucy?" he said, patting the seat beside him. Lucy smiled and sat down, feeling his hand slide over her back. He leaned in closer, his breath hot against her ear. "You're a beautiful woman," he murmured, his hand drifting lower. Lucy forced herself to giggle and lean into him, playing the part. "Thank you, Don Carlos. I've heard so much about you." Don Carlos's eyes glittered with pleasure. "Oh, have you now? What kind of things?" Lucy kept her smile fixed, her mind racing. "That you're a powerful man, someone who knows how to get what he wants." His grip tightened on her waist. "And what do you want, Lucy?" She leaned closer, her lips almost brushing his ear. "To get to know you better," she whispered. He laughed, a deep, throaty sound. "I like you," he said, his hand sliding to her thigh. "Why don't you get us some drinks, beautiful?" Lucy nodded, her heart pounding. She stood up and made her way to the bar, feeling Don Carlos's eyes on her the entire time. She ordered 2 drinks and discreetly slipped the powdered poison into his glass. Taking a deep breath, she returned to the table and handed him the drink. "To new friends," she said, raising her glass. Don Carlos raised his glass but didn't drink. He looked at her, a sly smile on his lips. "Why don't you feed me, Lucy?" Her heart sank. "Feed you?" He nodded, leaning back in his chair. "Yes. If you want me to drink, you have to feed me." Lucy swallowed hard, forcing herself to maintain her composure. She picked up his glass, bringing it to her lips, and took a small sip before leaning in and pressing her mouth to his. She let the liquid flow from her mouth to his, feeling his hands roam over her body as he drank. Don Carlos grinned, his eyes never leaving hers. "Good girl," he murmured, finishing the drink. Moments passed, and nothing happened. Lucy felt a wave of panic. Had she done it wrong? But then Don Carlos's expression changed. He blinked, his hand going to his throat. What did you—" He never finished the sentence. He slumped forward, the glass slipping from his hand and shattering on the floor. His guards rushed forward, but it was too late. Don Carlos was dead. Lucy stood up, her legs shaking. She had done it. She turned and walked out of the nightclub, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and triumph. Back at Jaguar's mansion, she was ushered into his office. Jaguar looked up as she entered, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Well?" "It's done," she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. Jaguar nodded, pleased. "Good. You've proven your loyalty. The boy will be safe. For now." She breathed a sigh of relief, but the tension in her body didn't ease. She knew this was just the beginning. As she walked back to her quarters, her mind raced with the gravity of her new reality. She had to stay strong and smart if she wanted to protect Matthew and herself. The next few weeks were grueling. Jaguar had Lucy involved in more of his operations, testing her loyalty and abilities. She was given tasks ranging from mundane administrative work to more dangerous missions. With each success, she gained more of his trust. One evening, as Lucy finished filing documents in Jaguar's office, he looked up from his desk. "Lucy, you've been quite resourceful lately. How are you finding your new responsibilities?" Lucy kept her expression neutral. "I'm managing, Jaguar. Thank you for trusting me." Jaguar smiled, a cold, calculating smile. "Trust is earned, and you're on the right path. But remember, loyalty is—" "I understand," she replied, her voice steady despite the anxiety gnawing at her. Days turned into weeks, and Lucy's role in Jaguar's organization grew. She attended meetings, observed the inner workings of the criminal enterprise, and learned to navigate the treacherous waters she found herself in. Her intelligence and quick thinking earned her a place by Jaguar's side. One day, Jaguar summoned her to his office. "Lucy, I have another task for you. A shipment is arriving tonight, and I need you to oversee its delivery." Lucy nodded, hiding her unease. "Of course, Jaguar." As she walked out, she felt the eyes of Jaguar's men on her. She knew she was constantly being watched, and any misstep could be fatal. She couldn't afford to let her guard down, not even for a moment. That night, Lucy stood on the docks, the cold wind biting at her skin. She watched as the shipment was unloaded, her mind sharp and focused. She had to ensure everything went smoothly. Any mistake could cost her the fragile trust she had built with Jaguar. One of Jaguar's men approached her, a scowl on his face. "Everything's in order?" Lucy nodded, her eyes scanning the crates. "Yes. Make sure it's all accounted for." The man grunted and went back to work. Lucy exhaled, her breath visible in the cold air. She had to stay vigilant. Back at the mansion, Lucy continued to keep Matthew close, teaching him how to read and write whenever they had a moment alone. She knew education was their key to survival and, eventually, their escape. "Lucy, why are you helping me so much?" Matthew asked one night, his eyes wide with curiosity. "Because you deserve better, Matthew," she said softly. "And because we have to look out for each other." Matthew smiled, a small flicker of hope in his eyes. "I promise I'll do my best." Richard sat in the dimly lit living room, his head in his hands. Tommy, his son, had finally recovered from his illness, but the household was far from peaceful. Tommy rarely spoke to Richard now, his young eyes filled with a mix of confusion and hurt. Emma, too, had grown distant. Her words were few, but each one carried a heavy weight of disappointment and anger. One evening, as Richard attempted to talk to Tommy, the boy turned away. "Why did you do it, Dad?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Richard's heart ached. "I thought I was doing the right thing. I wanted to save you and your mother." Tommy looked at him, tears brimming in his eyes. "But what about Lucy? You sold her." Emma, standing in the doorway, crossed her arms. "He's right, Richard. You chose one child over another. How could you?" Richard had no answer. The guilt and shame were overwhelming. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I will find a way to bring her back, I promise." Emma shook her head, her eyes cold. "Promises don't mean anything now, Richard. Actions do. Determined to make things right, Richard decided to turn himself into the police, hoping they could help him save Lucy. However, before he could act on his plan, Jaguar's men intercepted him. They dragged him away. Richard found himself back at Jaguar's mansion, stripped of any dignity. He was forced to do menial tasks, cleaning floors and serving drinks, a constant reminder of his failure. The once proud man was now just another servant in the sprawling estate. One afternoon, as he scrubbed the marble floors, he saw Lucy from a distance. She was different now, colder, more composed. Her eyes no longer held the innocence he remembered. She moved with a confidence that both saddened and amazed him. He watched as she interacted with Jaguar's men, her expressions calculated, her words chosen carefully. She had adapted to survive, and it pained Richard to see what she had become because of him. Days turned into weeks. Richard's duties were relentless, but each task brought him closer to the truth of his daughter's new life. He saw her strength, her resilience, and he felt both pride and regret. One evening, he managed to catch her alone in the kitchen, away from prying eyes. "Lucy," he whispered, his voice trembling. "It's me, Dad." Lucy turned slowly, her face a mask of calm. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice devoid of warmth. "I tried to go to the police," he explained, "but they caught me. I wanted to fix things." Lucy looked at him, her eyes hard. "You can't fix this, Dad. You sold me to save Tommy. Now I have to live with that." Richard's eyes filled with tears. "I'm so sorry, Lucy. I was desperate. I thought I was saving the family." She sighed, the mask slipping for a moment to reveal a flicker of pain. "I know, Dad, but you made a choice, and now we all have to live with it." Richard nodded, unable to speak. He reached out to touch her arm, but she stepped back. "I have to go," she said. "Stay out of trouble. Don't make things worse." As Lucy walked away, her heart felt heavy. Seeing her father in such a degraded state was a torment she could scarcely endure. She kept her expression neutral, aware of the watchful eyes around her. She couldn't afford to show any weakness or let her emotions betray her. Richard, left standing in the dimly lit kitchen, watched his daughter disappear down the hallway. The sight of her walking away, so strong yet so distant, tore at his heart. He had never felt more helpless. The next morning, Richard was assigned to clean the mansion's grand dining hall. He scrubbed the floors, his knees aching and his hands raw from the harsh chemicals. As he worked, he saw Lucy from a distance, moving with the cold precision she'd learned to adopt. She was no longer the vibrant, carefree girl he remembered. She had become someone he barely recognized, hardened by the harsh realities of their situation. Lucy caught glimpses of Richard throughout the day. Each time, her heart ached. She saw him bent over, scrubbing floors, serving drinks, doing all the menial tasks that Jaguar's men ordered him to do. It pained her deeply, but she knew she had to stay strong. Showing any sign of softness could be dangerous for both of them. One afternoon, as she was passing through a hallway, she overheard two guards talking about Richard. "Can you believe that old man?" one of them sneered. "Reduced to nothing more than a servant. It's pathetic." Lucy clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. She wanted to scream at them, to defend her father, but she knew she couldn't. She had to keep her composure, had to remain the ice-cold figure she had become. That evening, she found a moment to speak with Richard again, this time in the shadows of the garden where they wouldn't be overheard. "Dad," she whispered urgently, "you need to be careful. They're watching us constantly." Richard nodded, his face etched with lines of worry and regret. "I know, Lucy. I can't stand seeing you like this. It's all my fault. Lucy took a deep breath, steadying herself. What's done is done. We can't change the past, but we can find a way out of this. We just have to be smart and patient. I'll do whatever it takes, Richard said, his voice filled with determination. I won't fail you again. She hoped he meant it, because she was about to take the biggest risk of her life. Detective Harris had managed to arrange this meeting through a series of discreet messages, and Lucy knew that this was their best and possibly only chance to take down the Jaguar. As she approached the abandoned warehouse, Lucy felt a mixture of anticipation and fear. She slipped inside and found Harris waiting in the shadows. He stepped forward, his face serious, but eyes filled with determination. Lucy, he said quietly, we don't have much time. We need to act fast. Lucy nodded. I understand. What's the plan? Harris pulled out a set of documents and maps, spreading them on a nearby table. I've been undercover for months, gathering intel on Jaguar's operations. He's planning a major shipment next week. We can use this to our advantage. Lucy leaned over the table, studying the documents. What do we need to do? We're going to plant false information, Harris explained. We'll make Jaguar believe that there's a traitor within his ranks. This will sow discord and confusion, giving us the opportunity to strike. Lucy thought for a moment, then nodded. Okay, how do we start? We need to create convincing evidence of betrayal, Harris said. I have some fake documents here that implicate one of his top lieutenants. You'll need to plant these in the right places and make sure they get noticed. And then what? Lucy asked. Once the seed of doubt is planted, Jaguar will start to turn on his own men, Harris said. That's when we make our move. I'll alert my team and we'll coordinate a raid on his warehouse. It's risky, but it's our best shot. Lucy took a deep breath. I'll do it. But what about Matthew and my father? Harris placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. We'll get them out. I promise. The next few days were a blur of careful planning and covert actions. Lucy moved through Jaguar's mansion with a new sense of purpose, planting the fake documents in strategic locations. She made sure to act normal, maintaining the facade of loyalty and obedience. One evening, as she served drinks to Jaguar and his men, she noticed the first signs of suspicion taking root. Two of Jaguar's lieutenants were arguing in hushed tones, casting wary glances at each other. Lucy's heart raced. The plan was working. Jaguar himself seemed more tense than usual, his eyes constantly scanning the room as if looking for threats. Lucy kept her distance, watching and waiting for the right moment. Late one night, Harris contacted Lucy again, this time through a discreet message slipped under her door. Tomorrow night. Be ready. Lucy spent the next day in a state of heightened alert. She knew the raid would happen soon, and she had to make sure everything was in place. She whispered reassurances to Matthew, promising him that they would soon be free. As night fell, Lucy made her way to the warehouse where Jaguar's shipment was being prepared. She saw Harris already there, hidden in the shadows, with his team. She gave him a small nod, and he signaled his men to move into position. The raid began with a sudden, explosive force. The sound of gunfire and shouts filled the air as Harris and his team stormed the warehouse. Lucy ran through the chaos, her heart pounding, searching for Matthew and her father. The warehouse was a battlefield. Jaguar's men fired wildly, trying to hold off the assault, but they were quickly overwhelmed by the coordinated attack of the police. Lucy found Matthew hiding behind a stack of crates, his eyes wide with fear. "Matthew!" she shouted, pulling him to his feet. We need to find Dad and get out of here." They ran through the maze of crates and machinery, dodging bullets and avoiding the collapsing structures around them. Finally, they found Richard, struggling with one of Jaguar's thugs. Lucy picked up a discarded pipe and swung it with all her might, knocking the man unconscious. "Lucy!" Richard gasped, pulling her into a brief, tight hug. "Thank God you're safe." "No time for that now," she said urgently. "We have to move." They made their way towards the exit, but Jaguar and a group of his men blocked their path. Jaguar's eyes were filled with rage as he pointed a gun at Lucy. "You think you can betray me and get away with it?" Lucy stepped forward, her eyes cold. "It's over, Jaguar. The police are here. You have no way out." Jaguar laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "You're wrong. I'll kill you all before I let you take me down." Before anyone could react, Jaguar fired his gun. The shot echoed through the warehouse, and Lucy felt a sharp pain in her side. She staggered, but then saw Matthew leap in front of her, taking the next bullet meant for her. "Matthew!" she screamed, catching him as he fell. Harris and his team burst into the room, guns blazing. In the chaos, Lucy managed to grab a gun from a fallen thug. She aimed it at Jaguar, her hands steady despite the pain. "This ends now," she said, her voice strong. She pulled the trigger, and Jaguar fell to the ground. The fight finally over. Lucy, Harris, Richard, and the injured Matthew were quickly taken to the hospital. Matthew's condition was critical, but the doctors assured them he would recover with time and care. Lucy stayed by his side, holding his hand, refusing to leave him for even a moment. The weeks in the hospital were long, but Lucy never left Matthew's side. She watched over him, her heart aching with a mix of hope and fear. Richard was there too, always supporting her, their bond growing stronger with each passing day. Slowly, Matthew's strength returned, and with it, the light in his eyes. One morning, as Lucy was helping Matthew with his exercises, a nurse entered with a broad smile. "Good news," she said. "The police have rounded up the last of Jaguar's men. You're all safe now." Relief washed over Lucy. She turned to Matthew, who was sitting up in bed, his eyes shining. "Did you hear that, Matthew? It's over. We're free." Matthew nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. "I knew you'd keep your promise, Lucy." 6 months later, life had begun to find a new rhythm for Lucy and her family. They had moved to a small house on the outskirts of the city, far from the shadows of their past. The house was modest, but it was filled with warmth and the promise of new beginnings. Matthew had come to live with them, becoming an integral part of their family. He and Tommy quickly became inseparable, their laughter filling the house. They played together, exploring the nearby woods and creating adventures only young boys could imagine. One Saturday morning, as Lucy prepared breakfast, she heard the sound of laughter from the living room. She peeked in to see Matthew and Tommy building a fort out of pillows and blankets. They were so absorbed in their play that they didn't notice her watching. "Do you think it's strong enough to keep out dragons?" Tommy asked, his eyes wide with excitement. Matthew nodded vigorously. "Definitely. Nothing can get through our fortress." Lucy chuckled to herself and returned to the kitchen, where Richard was reading the newspaper. "They're building a fortress," she said with a smile. Richard looked up, his eyes warm. "They're building memories. Good ones." As they sat down for breakfast, the boys joined them, their faces flushed with excitement. They ate together, the conversation flowing easily, filled with laughter and plans for the day ahead. That evening, after the boys had gone to bed, Lucy and Richard sat on the porch, enjoying the cool night air. The stars were bright, and the world seemed at peace. "You know," Richard said, breaking the comfortable silence, I never thought we'd get here. But we did. Lucy nodded, leaning her head against his shoulder. We did. And it's because we never gave up. We fought for each other. Richard took her hand, squeezing it gently. We'll keep fighting, Lucy. For this family. For our future. Lucy smiled, feeling a deep sense of contentment. Yes, we will. As they sat there, wrapped in the quiet comfort of their home, Lucy felt a sense of hope for the first time in a long while. They had faced the worst and come out the other side stronger and more united. Now it was time to build a future filled with love and happiness. They were free, and together they would make sure they stayed that way.